I'm going to make some very quick housekeeping remarks, and then I'll get it turned over. Well, hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location. My name is Audrey Mossberger, and I'm Director of Events at the National Bureau of Asian Research. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's expert discussion on reshaping Indo-Pacific trade relations through renewed American engagement. Before turning it over to NBR's president, Roy Camphausen, I'd like to offer a few quick tips to optimize your experience. First, to change your screen view, you can navigate to the upper right-hand corner of your screen and toggle between the various options. We recommend grid view or focus view for this discussion, as each panelist will be pinned during their respective remarks. You've probably noticed that your microphone is muted for this event. However, we do encourage you to get involved when it's time for audience Q&A following remarks by our panels. Please type your questions into the WebEx chat box, which can be opened by clicking on the chat icon in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Simply select everyone from the drop-down box, type your question, and hit enter. Our moderators will do their best to present all questions to our panels within the allotted time. For those joining us via live stream, welcome, and we encourage you to email questions to events@nbr.org. We look forward to what promises to be a very engaging discussion with our expert panels. And with that, I turn it over to Roy. Thank you.
Thanks, Audrey, and welcome everyone. I'm Roy Camphausen, president of NBR, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this very timely discussion of the broad contours of U.S. trade policy with Asia under the Biden administration, including a discussion of broader Indo-Pacific trade trends. The past several years have seen major shifts in the Indo-Pacific trade environment. Major multilateral trade agreements have been concluded, such as the CPTPP and RCEP, and these offer competing visions for the future of Indo-Pacific trade. Several major regional players, including both the US and India, are not a part of either agreement, suggesting that the two agreements alone do not represent the totality of the path forward. In addition to being a leader in RCEP, China has also concluded a comprehensive agreement on investment with the EU, pending ratification by the EU Parliament. A number of smaller agreements have also been reached, including the US-China and US-Japan agreements, as well as the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, a groundbreaking digital trade agreement that reflects the ever-growing importance of digital trade issues to the region. Beyond trade agreements, we've also seen significant disruptions to regional and global supply chains. The US-China trade war, coupled with rising fears about risks of disruption or economic coercion emanating from China, have led many companies to diversify their supply chains to reduce their reliance on China. Even so, China remains a highly desirable place for FDI, and many US companies retain important manufacturing and distribution operations there. The COVID-19 pandemic has added a level of complexity to these trends that was impossible to predict and difficult to respond to. Indo-Pacific trade, especially intra-regional trade, is big and diverse enough that it will continue to evolve in important ways in coming days, even without consideration of external factors. The Biden administration is pursuing several foreign policy and trade policy changes that could have significant effects on the region. An emphasis on restoring US leadership and commitment to multilateralism may open up opportunities to respond more effectively to China's increasingly assertive behavior, achieve improvements in digital, environmental, and labor standards, and possibly to eventually re-engage with major trade agreements. Helping us assess regional receptivity to the Biden administration's trade policy agenda are two distinguished panels. They'll discuss the Biden administration's approach to trade policy and the implications of this approach on regional trade trends. We should have some great discussions today. In related topics, be on the lookout in coming days for forthcoming NBR reports on South Korean data governance and disinformation in Taiwan, as well as a collection of essays examining China's growing digital influence in the April issue of Asia Policy. Finally, before turning over to the first panel, I'm pleased to announce that NBR has launched our Undergraduate Diversity Fellowship, part of NBR's ongoing Advancing Racial Justice initiative. will begin accepting applications next month for the first iteration of this new annual fellowship that seeks to increase diversity in the field of Asian studies by better engaging with students from historically underrepresented groups early in their academic careers. The latest way in which NBR seeks to fulfill its second core mission to train the next generations of Asia policy specialists. Okay, let's jump into today's dialogue. I'm glad to turn the gavel over to my colleague, NBR Executive Vice President Michael Wills, the moderator of the first panel. Thank you once again to everyone for joining. Michael, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Roy, and good morning, everyone, from a beautiful sunny Seattle. Our first panel today has three distinguished speakers, really an all-star cast in terms of US trade policy. I'm going to briefly introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking. They're all primed to make a few minutes of remarks and share their observations. And then, as Audrey mentioned, we'll have some time for Q&A. Please do type those questions as you think about them into the chat, and they'll be channeled to me, and I'll pose those to our presenters today. First up will be Charles Boustany, a longtime congressman from Louisiana, longtime collaborator with NBR and advisor to our trade and energy work, and has been a counselor with NBR since retiring from public service. Charles, Happy New Year. It's the first time we've seen each other this year. Thanks for joining us this morning and this afternoon. Charles will talk briefly about the domestic context of the Biden administration's trade policy, and we'll then turn to Wendy Cutler. Wendy is the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute based in Washington, D.C., a 3-decade career at USTR and finished as acting Deputy USTR, and it was involved in numerous negotiations with many of our Asian partners. And she will speak next about some of the international aspects of the Biden administration's trade policy. And I guess, Wendy, one thing I'd be very interested to hear your views on are the extent to which the Biden team will return to a more multilateral approach to trade policy as opposed to the Trump administration's preference for bilateral initiatives. And then our third speaker will be Ambassador Robert Holleyman. He's the president and CEO of Crowell Mooring International, also a USTR veteran and a key leader there on digital trade issues. And he will finish our panel this morning speaking about digital and technology trade issues. And so with that, I will turn back to Charles and ask him to make his opening remarks and observations.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to join you. And Roy, thank you. And thank you to NBR. And I'm really pleased to join this panel with Wendy Cutler and Robert Holleyman, who are both very, very knowledgeable. So the Biden administration in these early days is obviously, and for good reason, focused on the pandemic and the response to the pandemic, coordinating that effort, as well as the economic consequences of it. But here, so far today, we've not seen a lot in terms of policy details or priorities for the Biden administration trade agenda. We've seen a few actions: an executive order dealing with Buy American, a reinstatement of Section 232 national security tariffs on the UAE. They released the hold on the WTO Director General that Robert Lighthizer had placed. And so that opens the door for the WTO to start to become more functional. What we've seen so far, though, are general statements made by key players about the general direction. We know that a number of issues and actions by the previous administration are undergoing an extensive review. And we know also that the administration has launched a full-scale review of supply chain vulnerabilities. But in terms of statements to sort of give a general flavor of where this may go, let me start with the president himself. President Biden has repeatedly stated that no new trade agreements will be made until the domestic economy issues are fixed and the pandemic has been addressed. His national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, said that trade policy, quote, should focus on what improves wages and high-paying jobs in the United States rather than making the world safe for corporate investment. Catherine Tai, the nominee for USTR, has spoken repeatedly of a worker-centered trade policy, one not necessarily focused on competitiveness or lower prices of imported goods enjoyed by consumers, but she's been quoted as saying people are not just consumers, they are also workers and wage owners. And then finally, unknown to some of you, Brad Setzer, who's been named as a counselor to USTR. Brad was a previous Treasury Department staffer and was most recently with the Council on Foreign Relations. Brad has made the connection between problems with international taxation, the impact of low tax jurisdictions, and how this affects American manufacturing and ultimately American exports and jobs. So all of these statements sort of give a sense of where this may end up. So 2021 could be a busy year for trade policy on both the legislative fronts and the policy fronts, depending on how the administration lays out certain priorities. So for instance, will there be a move to just simply work through multilateral channels, the WTO, or will there be a combination of big effort with the WTO combined with some work on regional trade agreements? Or will there be a move to sectoral agreements, such as the digital trade agreement, which will be discussed later? It's unclear right now what exact approach will be taken. We'll get a better sense, I think, in April, which is the usual date time frame for the newly confirmed U.S. trade representative to lay out trade priorities for the administration to Congress as mandated by statute. But let me look at first focus on the legislative piece real quickly, and then move toward policy outlook. On the legislative front, there's several things. One, the general system of preferences expired on December 31st, 2021. It needs reforms. It's not clear what will happen from here with the Biden administration. Also, at the same time, the miscellaneous tariffs bill and the authority for a new round of tariff reductions expired at the end of December. Likewise, it's not clear what Congress will do with this or what the administration will recommend. Then looking forward to the end of June of this year, Trade Promotion Authority expires. And without Trade Promotion Authority, the ability for the administration to negotiate new deals with the acquiescence and agreement of Congress, the consultative process, really doesn't work. And so it's difficult for the administration to provide assurances that what will be negotiated and ultimately signed will be accepted by Congress. So Trade Promotion Authority is critical, and the politics of that are very complicated, especially now with a Republican Party that's become much more protectionist. And Democrats have typically been split on trade, so it's difficult to know where the votes will come from and how this actual legislation will be written. Linked to that is the reauthorization of trade adjustment assistance, which also needs reforms, and it's unclear how that will be dealt with because it expires at the same time as Trade Promotion Authority, at least the benefits do. And then we're going to see a lot of supply chain legislation. We have yet to see how the Biden administration will prioritize that in working with Congress, and the same with China. So political dysfunction, hyperpartisanship will still be a major factor going forward as all these things play out. On the policy outlook, there's a lot of unfinished business in various stages of negotiation, whether it was trade negotiations, China, Japan, UK, India, and so forth. Also ongoing enforcement issues such as the Boeing Airbus dispute and the associated tariffs that have been implied. The issue of the appellate body at the WTO and a general WTO reform agenda. We don't know where that's going yet. And then there's a disposition on a number of tariffs that were implemented during the Trump administration, including Section 301 tariffs on China, how they'll be used in China negotiations, but also the expanded use of Section 301, for instance, against Vietnam for currency manipulation, and the use of 301 tariffs against countries that are implementing digital services taxes. Likewise, Section 232, the national security tariffs, are also still out there. It's not clear what the Biden administration will do with those. These are especially important for the sake of multilateralism and bringing the European Union in to some alignment. And then secondly, in the policy area, the response to market developments. You know, what are the adverse consequences for American business and agriculture resulting from the implementation of CPTPP? all these agreements that have been finalized, some that still need to be ratified, like RCEP. These will all affect supply chains, they will affect rules of origin, and all seemingly will put the U.S. Business community at a disadvantage. How will this be dealt with? Same goes for the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment completed by the EU and China. We're still trying to understand how that will change the dynamics. It certainly created a friction point between the EU and the United States in terms of trying to get to sort of an agreed approach to China. There's also the OECD international tax issue that's still outstanding, and the administration will need to engage there. The EU efforts to look at a carbon tax and border adjustments, which will be controversial here in the US, and the impact of trade. And then there's the new EU Commission proposal for transatlantic cooperation. We have not seen a response yet from the Biden administration to a fairly comprehensive EU agenda that they've put forth. So in conclusion, a number of major priorities have been announced by the Biden administration. These priorities will likely conflict with each other in terms of what's a leading priority versus secondary. These include climate policy, labor, environmental regulations, Buy American requirements, the reshoring of supply chains or creation of more resilient supply chains, jobs and economic inequality, repairing transatlantic relations, multilateralism, and the response to China. Balancing all these things will be very difficult. Which ones will take priority over others, which ones will compete, remains to be seen. We don't know how the administration is going to lay this out. There are internal conflicts within those. And then finally, the interagency process. Trade policy typically has been housed with the the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. I think we're going to see some competing poles for power within the administration with regard to trade policy. And so how the interagency process works in that regard remains to be seen, because you're going to have individuals at the State Department, the NSC, USTR as traditional, the new climate portfolio with Secretary Kerry and others, including the person who's heading up the Asia directions, Kurt Campbell. All of these will be vying for influence, and how trade policy fits within all of that remains to be seen. I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Thanks, Charles. Let's go straight over to Wendy and continue the remarks here from our panelists.
Well, thanks, Michael, and it's really my honor to share the virtual stage with Charles and Robert. And maybe I can pick up on what the points Charles was making. I think he did an excellent job in kind of laying out the trade agenda for the coming year. I know a lot of people are saying, oh, we're not going to be doing trade this year. It's going to be busy on the trade front. Maybe we won't be negotiating big new deals, but there's a lot of ongoing work. And I would also put on the plate is that as the Biden administration seeks to improve and strengthen relations with allies and partners, guess what? They're probably going to be asking the Biden team to do certain things on trade. And so I think there will be a strong trade agenda for the coming year. Now, in terms of Asian trade policy, what does this mean? And one of the things I just want to underscore is that the Indo-Pacific that the administration will be dealing with is going to be very different than the region 4 or 5 years ago. Clearly, the region has not been standing still with respect to trade. We have seen now we're over 2 years with the TPP in force among 7 countries. And the UK just announced formally that it wants to join. And RCEP agreement was just signed last November. And folks are predicting that it will probably come into effect the first quarter of 2022. And the United States is not part of either agreement. So that's one change. The second change I would just highlight is that a lot of Asian countries, most of them, almost all of them, have strengthened their commercial ties with China in recent years. Not only is China their largest trading partner, not only are many of them now in the RCEP agreement with China, but China has been the growing market. And as a result, a lot of Asian countries that are in the neighborhood are solidifying ties solidifying economic ties with China. I mean, you know, we can talk about Australia later and some other hiccups and tensions among certain Asian countries. But for the most part, the relations, the economic and commercial relations have been strengthening. And China proportionally is constituting a larger share of trade with most Asian countries than the United States now, which means the United States, by definition, has lost some of its leverage as its market is not as attractive as it has been in previous years. And then the other thing, it's just some kind of a non-tangible thing I think the new team will see, and I've seen through my my virtual meetings and also through my travels as of a year ago, and that is that there's a new confidence that's building in Asia. I think when the United States first withdrew from the TPP, for example, the other TPP countries, they couldn't imagine going forward without the United States. They didn't know what to do. But over time, they kind of figured that out. And by the end, they really did not need us. And we've seen this confidence then be translated into other negotiations, as well as other initiatives in the WTO, in APEC, and elsewhere. Now, Charles has done a great job kind of outlining some of the major themes of the Biden trade policy. Like him, I couldn't agree more. We've yet to see how a lot of these themes will be kind of operationalized. What do they really mean in terms of, you know, of actual policies, initiatives, and actions? But a number of themes I think we can extrapolate, and I think it's safe to say that the Biden administration is going to probably spend a great deal of attention on what I would call enforcement, making sure the trade agreements that we have entered into are working and are working for the American middle class and American workers. And here USMCA, I think, comes to the top of the queue. I think we're going to see more dispute settlement cases with respect to USMCA implementation. And I also think we're going to see the continued use of our trade laws to defend the interest of US workers and the US middle class. But we're also going to see a world where the term multilateralism is not a dirty word. I mean, over the past 4 years, my understanding is that when certain US officials went to international meetings and they were negotiating statements that would come out of these meetings, whether at the WTO or APEC or G20, when the word multilateral or multilateralism emerged in the document, the instructions to the US team was to delete it, along with some other words like rules-based system. And you know, this is changing already. We've seen the United States return to the World Health Organization, to the UN Human Rights Commission. That just happened, I think, yesterday. And with respect to the World Trade Organization, we just joined the consensus for the selection of the Director General from Nigeria, Dr. Ngozi. And my understanding now is that the World Trade Organization will have a special meeting this coming Monday, hopefully to put her now in the office so the important substantive work of the WTO can begin. Now, one of my big concerns when I look at how quickly Asia is moving with respect to trade agreements, with respect to supply chain integration, and their overall attitude about trade, and that is that it's a good thing, they're moving quickly. And they're not standing still. Not only is China not standing still, having just concluded the comprehensive agreement on investment with Europe, also a signatory to RCEP, but China's now talking about reviving the trilateral FTA talks with Japan and Korea, and also it is expressed some interest in considering joining CPTPP. And it's not just China, it's other countries in the region as well. Korea has concluded a number of additional bilateral trade agreements with Southeast Asian countries. Australia and Indonesia concluded an FTA. Recently, the Europe-Vietnam FTA came into effect last year, and the list goes on. And while Asia's moving on, the United States over the past 4 years has been standing still. And one of my concerns is that given all the domestic issues we need to sort through and deal with, and rightly so, that the gap between the activity in Asia and the United States may widen. So then the question is, how can we re-engage economically in the Asia-Pacific region? Now, we can do this through, for example, playing a leadership role in international organizations, including APEC. We can also do this by showing up at Asian summits, ASEAN summits. Showing up and participating in these meetings is extremely valued by our Asian colleagues. And I'm sure the Asian team in place now, led by Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, they recognize that. So I think we're going to be at those meetings. But with time, the other countries are going to be asking us, well, okay, this is great, but what can we do? What initiatives can you put on the table? And here, a number of countries will probably want to find out what our plans are with respect to rejoining the CPTPP, particularly Japan, that was trying for 4 years with no luck to convince the Trump administration to come back. But I don't see CPTPP in the cards anytime soon, if at all. And if we were ever to return, I think we would need very significant updates and revisions. But CPTPP is not the only alternative for us to be engaged substantively in the region on trade. And I want to conclude with the thought that, in my view, I think pursuing narrower sectoral deals is the way to go for this administration. I think there are a number of topics. Robert's going to talk about digital trade. I think medical supply chains is an area where work needs to be done, and we can establish secure supply chains with other like-minded countries in the region. And also the whole issue of climate and the environment is ripe for some type of agreement and aligns very well with the overall climate policy of the Biden administration. These sectoral narrow deals, are they perfect? No, they're not perfect. They have a number of benefits. They can be done quicker. They can be done easily. Typically, they would not need congressional approval, although congressional consultation would be very important. And they can provide important momentum for additional initiatives as well, and help us rebuild trust with our Asian trading partners and partners around the world. On the negative side, however, they do present challenges, right? Because they don't allow for trade-offs by definition among a whole bunch of topics. They force the administration and other countries to pick one issue and not deal with other issues. And they can also raise some WTO concerns. But in conclusion, my view is, despite these challenges, I think these challenges can be surmounted, and these agreements offer, I think, the best path forward, particularly in the short term, as we try and rebuild our engagement and leadership in the Indo-Pacific region.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Let's go straight over to Robert Holleyman for his remarks, and then we'll open up for questions. So, and again, as a reminder, as you listen to our panelists this morning and questions are arising, please do send those through the chat function to our colleagues, and they'll channel them to me.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be with you, and very much appreciate this invitation and all the work over the years that the National Bureau of Asian Research has done. It's also always been a very important source of information and collaboration, so appreciate the opportunity. Also appreciate getting to speak with my former colleague, Wendy Cutler, a longtime friend who was across the hall from me at USTR, and my former member of Congress, Charles Boustany, because I lived in his home district. And so great friends, and great to be with them on the discussion today. Let me talk about one of the sectors that Wendy just teed up, which is the digital sector of the digital economy, and how that is a way where the U.S. has shown leadership in the area of trade for a long time, how that has the potential to be a new avenue for engagement going forward, including in the Biden-Harris administration, and then some contrasts around what other key trading partners are doing in this area. Let me start with a self-evident, but I think an even more important statement than ever before, which is why has the U.S. taken such a big lead around the digital economy and digital trade? And the answer is because it is such a big driver of the growth, the changes, and it's an area where the U.S. has historically had an enormous leadership and an enormous vested self-interest in our own country. With that said, the U.S. has really pioneered this approach, but I think the biggest change that we have, which is important to note, is that this is not a technology issue. That in a world that has become heavily digitized, where there's been a digital transformation, where not only businesses who are tech businesses, but also businesses who are traditional manufacturing or small businesses or startups or academic institutions, the digital platforms, including around digital trade, are now fundamental to how all of those operate. So, we look back to probably the earliest U.S. efforts, which were, back in the 90s in the Clinton administration, and really focused on getting the WTO to issue a moratorium on customs duties for digital transmissions. And that effort, which basically remains in place, although not a permanent moratorium, became the earliest parts of the chapters that the U.S. negotiated around digital trade, which we typically called at the time e-commerce, and trade. And so if you look back at what I would describe as the heyday of U.S. negotiations in this space, between 2004 with the U.S.-Singapore agreement through 2012, the U.S. struck 12 trade agreements that had digital provisions and chapters in place. And those agreements, again, talked about access to markets, they talked about principles of non-discrimination, and they were bilateral agreements. So while the U.S. in some cases was the demandeur, we were not alone, and we found our partners willing to collaborate with us, and that helped set the stage. We then move ahead to the next sort of giant leap, and in fact it was a giant leap, which was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And when that agreement was concluded, the U.S. had led the way, but not alone, in developing a much more rigorous and much more developed system of digital provisions that were designed to ensure that there would be data flows across borders subject to appropriate protections for personal privacy, ensured that there could be cooperation around issues around cybersecurity, ensure that there would be opportunities for companies, large or small, to pick the technology of their choice. So they wouldn't be required to pick a domestic technology provider in order to access that domestic market. They could really maximize the efficiencies of their system. And so that group of provisions, which we call the Digital 24, were really a dramatic acceleration of the foundations that the U.S. had set. So of course, when the U.S. left the TPP, that left the other 11 economies, as Wendy has talked about, to form the CPTPP. And while the CPTPP made some changes in other areas, particularly around intellectual property rights, one of the biggest areas that they left absolutely intact were the innovative provisions around digital trade. And those provisions, with the 7 countries who've now brought the CPTPP into force, are today the highest standard digital trade provisions that are enforceable anywhere in the world. And so I think that really established the new foundation. And unfortunately, the US is not part of that, but the US had a big role to play in helping seed the ground for that and moving forward. What's happened since then? Well, you've had really a division. The US went back to renegotiating old agreements, and so we have our NAFTA update with the USMCA. In fact, it took all of the provisions that were in the TPP on digital, added a few others around cross-border data transfers, added provisions around Section 230 of the U.S. Communications Decency Act, ensured that the APEC cross-border data transfer mechanism would be a valid enforcement mechanism, so it built upon that. The U.S. then added a non-enforceable agreement with Japan, which was the U.S. digital trade agreement, that also added some provisions that were beneficial for financial services and other institutions who wanted to move data across borders. That's what the U.S. did. In the meantime, we've seen more movement in Asia, particularly around last year. We saw the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement that was a model put out by Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile that was a modular approach that allowed new innovations and discussions around things like artificial intelligence to be brought to the table so that these would be living and breathing chapters. Now, the downside of that agreement is, like the US-Japan agreement, it is not enforceable, but it also allows for a higher level of ambition. And then we have the enforceable provisions of the Digital Economy Agreement, of the Singapore-Australia Digital Economy Agreement, which is the way in which Singapore and Australia are going to amend their bilateral FTA to bring the digital provisions into that. So we've seen in each of those build on what came before it. So those agreements build on the CPTPP, the bar is being raised. Finally, let me just note something where it appears the bar is being raised, but it is not, which is the RCEP agreement. The RCEP agreement, which of course is so significant because China is part of it, has also a provision, a chapter on e-commerce. And it purports to take some of the disciplines that are in place in the CPTPP and bring it into the RCEP. It's a step in the right direction, but the big challenge is that China has a concept of data sovereignty, which is actually antithetical in many respects to the openness around data in the CPTPP and elsewhere. And so as a result, all of the decisions of the parties in the digital provisions, the e-commerce provisions of the RCEP essentially are self-determined. So any party, China, any other party, could decide that it's in their national security interest or in their interest to require forced data localization, and they're allowed to do it without an enforceable mechanism. So it is a giant loophole, and that's why I think there is still an important reason for countries to move forward, for the US to get back in the game, and I hope that the digital chapters are key opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. I'm going to take the privilege of the moderator's chair here to ask a question to all of you. I'm struck by, on the one hand, going back to Charles' remarks, the huge pressures domestically. I mean, these competing priorities facing the administration, facing the country right now. And the very real practical impact is that the trade seems to be less of a priority. Certainly the politics don't suggest that there'll be quick solutions on trade. And yet, from Wendy's remarks and Robert's remarks, the dynamism of what's been taking place over the last few years and the fact that the region is moving so quickly, it raises, for me at least, a question that, how much risk is the United States facing in continuing to have the ability to shape the rules of trade moving forward? And the question is for all three of you, if you were in Catherine Tai's shoes now, looking to kind of try and influence the president, and sort of how would you argue for a renewed focus on trade, and sort of what case would you make to elevate the importance of trade to the US position, both in terms of its domestic and economic recovery as well as its international influence in the region? And I'm going to go reverse order. So Robert, Wendy, and then Charles, please.
Sure, I'll start on that. Look, I think we have. I think there are three risks. I do think it is quite, and I very much agree with Wendy and Charles about the U.S. sitting on the sidelines, and we should be writing the rules of trade. But I also think there's a huge risk for what's happened before, which is the U.S. negotiates an agreement, and then Congress and the American public decide they're not for it. And so, without any disrespect to what I think was a heroic effort in setting the new stage, I think we have to make sure that Congress is willing to move on trade initiatives that the U.S. negotiates. And I think that's part of what the reset is. I think that's also part of the appeal of some of the sectoral agreements. You know, I think the second part of this is that the U.S. has to recognize why trade can't be viewed in a vacuum. And the type of domestic investments we need are not only necessary to build confidence around trade, but they are fundamental to making sure that the U.S. can compete long-term against China and other economies. China that will be a larger economy than the U.S. and certainly a larger workforce, and trade policy alone is not the solution for how we compete in the medium and long term. And finally, you know, I just think that we have to also get in a mindset of talking about why these issues matter. And I think you can talk about some environmental and climate negotiations that would be appealing and how we make those matter. At the same time, I think there's a bit of a risk. I think it's a surmountable one around digital trade. If that's viewed as something that helps corporations and technology companies, what we need to do is make the context that you cannot have better health unless you're able to use health information and data to develop new cures across borders. We cannot deal with the systemic problem around climate change unless we have new technologies that work across borders to help address it. And we can't have those issues looked at as something that only affect a particular sector or a group of people. We have to be able to see why they matter to the country.
Thanks. Wendy?
Well, Robert, I agree with everything Robert said. And let me just add a few points here. I think the risks are great. Not only the risk of the U.S. standing still while Asia's moving forward. We've already seen our companies lose market access to markets. Our products are at a disadvantage, and that has enormous impact on workers in the United States, farmers, and other U.S. interests. We've also, we lose our ability to write the rules. And in fact, you know, Robert gave a great example of what happened in RCEP in the digital chapter, where you read all this language, but then you read this footnote, and the footnote basically, as Robert said, it kind of guts all the substance. You can do basically what you want to do. And I would not be surprised if we see that proposal being made elsewhere in other trade agreements, right? Because one thing I learned as a trade negotiator, everyone looks at what, you know, how they found common ground earlier, and people try and, you know, use the same language again. I'm not saying we or others would necessarily agree to it in another agreement, but language lives on. And if we're not at the table helping shape these rules, then I'm afraid these rules not only will not reflect our interests, but they can also kind of gut any enforceability as well. Now, you asked the question about, you know, the hypothetical, how does Catherine Tai, as the new USTR, how should she pitch doing trade to the president? First of all, let me just say, I have enormous respect for Catherine. I worked with her both at USTR and also when she was at the Ways and Means Committee. And I think if anyone can can try and bring together this consensus on trade. I think Catherine is the right person at the right time, having been instrumental in bringing USMCA over the finish line, working within her party where there's so many factions on trade in the Democratic Party, but also across the aisle. So the first point, if I were her, I'd make 3 points to the president and be really brief. One, look at USMCA, highest bipartisan approval of any trade agreement in recent years. And, you know, I was involved in that. I know how to kind of, you know, bring a consensus together. And if I can't bring a consensus together, I'll let you know when we won't go forward. Two, trade is not in a vacuum. Trade aligns with your domestic priorities, Mr. President. In fact, you know, you have put a premium on having access to needed medical equipment. You want to promote small and medium-sized enterprises in our economy. You think climate change is all hands on deck issue for the US government. In all of these areas, I can pursue initiatives, and frankly, in most of them, depending how they're negotiated, I can do it in a way that will not need congressional approval. So just off the top of my head, those would be 3 arguments I would use.
Thank you. And then Charles.
Well, I agree with everything that's been said, but Wendy and I have a little bit of a difference when it comes to congressional approval of these agreements. But putting that aside for a moment, if I were advising Catherine Tai and ultimately having some say with the president, I would say you have to understand that trade policy is a broad area of policy that links domestic policy with foreign policy on the economic front. And so because of that, to achieve your key priorities, whether it's building multilateralism in all these areas that they've talked about, building a more prosperous America, solving the inequality problems in the United States, continuing to grow the economy, you need to be engaged. We need to be fully engaged at the multilateral level, the regional level, and so forth. Secondly, foreign economic policy is critical for the success of the United States, and it's linked to our security policy. And if we separate that linkage, we fail. And if we're going to get to a point where we have credibility and leverage in the Indo-Pacific with regard to dealing with security, we have to have a robust trade policy, which is a major component of foreign economic policy. Because high-level trade and investment agreements, as Robert pointed out when he contrasted RCEP, those types of agreements, the high-level agreements that combine investment and trade, really play a major role in helping to solidify supply chain networks and global value chains. If the United States is not engaged, we're not going to be setting, putting our companies, our farmers, our manufacturers, our technology companies in position to be a major part of those value chain networks. And it directly impacts our prosperity back home. And then secondly, standards. Building out standards for the use of technology, standards for conduct and participation in supply chains and value chains is linked to trade agreements. And if we ignore that linkage, again, we are not going to be in a position to set standards, because even within the various standard setting bodies, whether it's the UN Telecommunications Union or other types of organizations like that, where standards are set, oftentimes when trade agreements are in place and standards are set through those regional trade agreements, those standards are settled by those countries, and those countries will then side with each other, or perhaps even with China, depending on the circumstances, within those bodies. And so standards will be set because we're not engaged and we're not involved. So I think those are all the reasons. And then finally, I think Wendy hit on this, we can't afford to fail in this. Catherine Tai is incredibly talented. I've worked with her as well. She showed her chops in the negotiation process with USMCA. I am convinced that we have to build a national consensus to move forward with trade in a very forward-leaning way for all the reasons I and Wendy and Robert laid out. I think Catherine can do it. Her challenge is going to be dealing with competing poles within the administration, within the interagency process, depending on where their priorities lie. But I think there's the fact that all of these priorities that the Biden administration have laid out can be linked back to trade and the architecture of trade. And if we use smart trade policy, we can achieve all of those, and we can basically coordinate all those efforts. So I think Catherine's well positioned to do it. She's going to have to be assertive, but that's my argument that I would make, that we have to be engaged because we cannot afford to fail.
Great, thank you.
Michael, if I can just make one point, because
Sure.
Charles hinted that he didn't agree with my congressional point. I just want to make clear that while these sectoral agreements that I'm talking about, at least the way I would shape them, might not require congressional approval, they would require congressional consultation. And I think one of the criticisms of the Trump administration was that they went forward with these partial deals and kind of surprised Congress at the end. And I think that has really set us back with Congress. So I think consultation with Congress is critical, not only at the beginning of the negotiation of bringing the deal home, but throughout the process.
Great, thanks. Let me follow up on the sectoral approach that Wendy, you and Robert both mentioned, and I know Charles has written about a lot as well. Playing that out, does that kind of sectoral approach make most sense when it's applied regionally or purely globally? And I'm thinking here with some of the, some of these specific examples that Robert, you were making with, say, an Australia-Singapore agreement or an Australia-New Zealand-Chile agreement. CPTPP is one example. Should the US focus its efforts on sectoral issues within a certain region, or would it make more sense to focus on those at a multilateral level? So that's one question. I'd be happy to have any of the three of you answer that. A related one would be playing out that scenario where if you imagine a world where a series of sectoral agreements has established certain standards for digital trade or for medical trade or supply chain security, how does that framework mesh with the existing sort of complex mess of both regional, sub-regional, bilateral trade agreements and the WTO structure? And what does it mean for countries that are part of those sectoral agreements and those on the outside? And long term, does that move us towards really a bifurcated market where the countries that have signed on to a certain sectoral agreement, if they represent the large share of companies and countries that are really dominant in that area, does that create the global market for that? Or do we risk in certain sectors almost a bifurcation that would, I think, for those in the business community, have pretty significant impacts? So apologies for a lot of questions there, but we are kind of reaching the time. So ask as much of those as you can, and we'll probably wrap up.
Michael, let me start on that process of what I think the pros are on sectoral agreements. One is that the U.S. can work to a high standard, and I think you can better do those bilaterally or regionally than a global high standard. Secondly is that, particularly for this current administration, it gets them back in the trade game where they're not willing to do a broad, comprehensive trade agreement for all the reasons we've discussed anytime in the near future. And third, I think that they then become important tools to negotiate the broader agreements where we really have set a new high standard, and we press other countries to reach that standard. So I think that they are important generally, and I think they're particularly important at this time for the U.S.
Thank you.
If I could just add to that, I think it really depends on the topic, whether you would want to look for a regional deal or just look for like-minded countries around the world. I think in the digital area, for all the reasons Robert mentioned, having a regional deal among Indo-Pacific countries makes a lot of sense because those countries, a lot of them have already engaged bilaterally or in other arrangements on high standard rules. And another reason I think it'd be good to start with the CPTPP countries, because CPTPP is a good baseline. So if you look in like an environment or climate, even though climate's not in the CPTPP, it has an extensive chapter on environment that touches on a lot of other important environmental issues. And that would be the baseline if you started with CPTPP. In my view, all of these deals would be WTO plus. So in other words, they wouldn't conflict with WTO rules, but the benefits would just flow to those that have signed the deal. But I think what would be key, and to kind of get at the point you made, Michael, would be to keep the door open for additional members that wanted to sign on as long as they could live up to the high standards, kind of like the TPP model. And, we've just seen the UK once again formally say it wants to accede to CPTPP. Ideally, these sectoral deals could provide important kind of pressure on the WTO to move quicker on deals in these areas, and ideally would create momentum for a WTO agreement. Because look, at the end of the day, sure, in multilateral deals with 164 countries agreeing to all these high standards, that would be the best. It would have the most impact. It would be easy to navigate around the world, knowing the rules, we're all agreeing to them. But that's not the reality. And so you have to look for second best. And that is looking for like-minded partners who want to go further, want to go quicker, and want to do it with you.
Thanks, Wendy.
I agree with Robert and Wendy on all those points. And I guess the only thing I would add would be certainly the risk is some kind of balkanization on standards, which makes it very difficult to navigate. Or yet perhaps, digital spheres of influence, which would be equally problematic. So I think the key is aggressively pursuing digital trade agreements and trying to sequence them to have the most impact. So I think I agree with Wendy's characterization about CPTPP as the quickest way for us to really impact the Indo-Pacific area and hopefully bring other partners in. But I think the other area we need to really focus on with digital trade is Europe, because if we can get to agreement with Europe, which we share a lot of interest and values, we have differences on the privacy issue and certain uses of data. But if we could get to a broad agreement, I think that would be a serious momentum changer in combination with the US basically working or joining CPTPP, or at least getting a digital trade agreement among the CPTPP countries.
Let's finish up. We're almost at time, but I'm really curious about this Europe, Asia, US angle here. I mean, Wendy's raised it a couple times now with the British request to join CPTPP. A number of you have mentioned the importance of a US-EU alignment on some of these digital trade and data security, data privacy type questions. What do you think the prospects of that kind progress in that area being made, say, over the next couple of years?
Well, the Europeans have made an overture now with the this new EU Commission proposal to the Biden administration. I hope the Biden administration takes a serious look at it. Now, again, the devil's in the details and working all that out. But I think there should be a starting point for a dialogue, and it will be a welcome change from what we had during the Trump years on this. But it's a pretty, it's a substantive document. I read it a couple of days ago, and it offers a roadmap. And so I think there's a good prospect for movement there. And I think there's a newfound sense of urgency in Europe about trying to repair the transatlantic relationship to deal with the challenge of China and other non-market economies. So I'm certainly hoping that the Biden administration, and I think they will, take this seriously and use that as a sort of a platform to start this deep engagement.
Thanks. Wendy, any final thoughts from you on that?
I agree with what Charles said. I just wouldn't underestimate the difficulties. It's one thing at a top level to say we should cooperate and move forward together on these issues with China, lurking in the background. It's another thing to actually, reach agreements on, particularly when the EU is going forward with regulations in a lot of areas in digital, which could be extremely and are extremely problematic for U.S. companies. But I don't think we have a choice. And I would hope that we could build goodwill with Europe, reset the relationship, hopefully solve some of these outstanding bilateral irritants, and then be able to work with them hand in glove with respect to the China issues, as well as the data issues, as well as other issues that are just, facing the global trading system that need to be dealt with.
Thank you.
And I'll just conclude by saying, look, we should not underestimate the challenge of negotiating with the EU. Despite all of our commonalities, there are major challenges on trade that we've seen in prior negotiations around the TTIP agreement, around TISA. At the same time, I would like to believe we have more in common. We certainly share a lot of national security interests with them that impact us. We certainly share with them a lot of the concerns around the distorting effects of excess capacity, particularly driven out of China around steel and aluminum. We've not dealt with that particularly well in recent years because we've sort of alienated our allies. But I think it's absolutely important that we get back at the table, try to figure out where we can work together. And so I would encourage us to be active in those negotiations, in part to help us address the longer term challenge with China, not an economic challenge only, but also the philosophical and human rights challenges that we face.
Right. Well, thank you. We're out of time. Appreciate everybody's who sent in questions, and certainly want to thank our three wonderful presenters today, Robert Holleyman, Wendy Cutler, and Charles Boustany. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn over to our second panel now, my colleague Alison Solwinski, who's our Vice President of Research at NBR.
Thanks so much, Michael. Can everybody hear me? Good, great. All right, so we're gonna kick off our second panel discussion, which I'm sure I have a feeling is going to build quite nicely and complement a lot of the key themes that were raised in the first panel discussion. So we can kind of build and perhaps dive into some of the unanswered questions that folks had. So in this discussion, we're going to really focus on the future of Indo-Pacific trade with a focus on how Japan, China, and ASEAN nations have altered their approach to trade relations in the face of reduced US leadership to the region, and how re-engaged America might impact those trends. So I'm joined, very pleased to be joined by three fantastic women. We'll start and I'll kind of share their bios in the order that we'll go in. We'll start by hearing from Claire Reade, who is a senior counsel at Arnold & Porter. From 2006 to 2014, she served in the office of the US Trade Representative, first as chief counsel for China trade enforcement, and then as assistant USTR for China affairs. In that former role, she coordinated USTR's efforts to ensure Chinese compliance with its WTO and other trade obligations. And in the latter role, she led US trade negotiations with China. So she will speak on a kind of overview of US-China trade under the new Biden administration. And then we'll turn to Saori Katada, who is a professor of international relations at the University of Southern California. Dr. Katada focuses on international political economy, including regional integration, trade agreements, and financial politics. And she will address US trade relations and engagement with East Asia. And then we'll round it all out, hearing from Ellen Frost, who is a senior advisor and fellow at the East-West Center, and a visiting distinguished research fellow at the National Defense University's Institute of National Strategic Studies. She previously served in the US government as counselor to the US Trade Representative, as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Economic and Technology Affairs, and in various positions in the Treasury and State Departments. So Ellen will address US trade relations and some engagement with Southeast Asia. And as with the previous panel, hopefully we'll have a little bit of time. Each of the panelists will spend about 5 to 7 minutes and a little bit of time to ask a few questions and pull some themes from questions in the chat that you all sent. So with that, we'll turn it first over to Claire.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it is marvelous to be on this panel with these other fantastic women. So, and that was a great panel that we just heard as well. So with regard to the Biden approach to US-China trade, I think it's important to start with some context. So I think the Bidens have made their view clear through both Biden's direct statements and proxies that the China relationship is going to have multiple personalities. We're going to see adversary, we're going to see competitor, and we're going to see cooperation, depending on the context. And I think trade and investment are likely to be realms for competition with maybe a smattering of cooperation in certain areas. But the other thing that Biden has made very clear is that China is going to require an overall strategic vision and an overall strategic plan where trade will be one tool in that plan. And by the way, as others have mentioned, that trade tool is going to be designed to benefit US workers and the US economy, not multinational corporations and their investors and shareholders. So it's a tight focus here, and I think that's important for thinking through how you approach the Biden administration with issues. Now, the Biden administration has also said that they will approach China from, quote, a position of strength, close quote, using allies, using international rulemaking, and building the US economy back better to compete better. That's all relevant to the trade relationship. And it signals a multilateral and a bilateral dimension to Biden's actions. It's going to take time, though, to decide this overall strategy. So I would say don't expect any big moves on trade anytime soon. But that doesn't mean nothing's going to happen. So what will Biden's trade goals be? We have to start by looking at the realities here. China is a huge market, a huge economy, and we can't simply jettison our relationship. Not just talking about our trade, but the many adverse impacts on the United States if we try to leave and the rest of the world stays in, which they will. So what are the main problems? China's trade with the rest of the world can create problematic distortions as well as national security concerns. And China keeps its market closed in a number of ways while being able to compete in our open market. That strengthens its companies and hurts ours. So we need to take steps to safeguard against damage to the US economic future from China. What does that mean in terms of trade actions? We want to remove distortions and remove the deficiencies or remediate the deficiencies in the China system that hurt our ability to grow, to compete in global markets and in China. So we want to level the playing field as much as we can. Biden makes the point that he's going to rely on allies. And I think that's a very good point. I think we do need them to try to make better international rules, to try to cooperate effectively to cabin in some key China distortions where our actions alone just won't work. So what do we see out there right now? We see that Japan, the EU, and the United States work on subsidies and forced tech transfer rules and on the development of SOE disciplines. We see in the international standard setting realm that there's an awareness that the United States needs to be engaged, and they really have to watch everywhere to try to keep that level playing field. We see the possibilities of plurilaterals on issues like the digital economy, as was discussed in the previous panel. And we also see a number of informal alignments with our allies, particularly effective concrete actions where there are national security issues. And I would say Huawei is a kind of quasi-example with regard to infrastructure build-outs and the national security concerns, but there are other issues. And obviously, international cooperation is critical there, because if we act unilaterally and everybody else doesn't follow, then we don't have any better national security and we haven't done it. What about TPP? Well, US politics, I think, are a major bar here. I don't think there are any prospects unless and until it looks like the deal has been honed to directly help ordinary Americans in the US economy. And it takes a great deal of bandwidth to create and move these deals. So I would not be holding my breath for anything happening in the next while on that. That said, over the longer term, I do think we need to evaluate seriously the risks of significant economic losses to the United States from not having efficient and integrated tie-ups in Asia. You know, so the impact of China improving its trade relations with other countries, with RCEP, with the China-EU deal, with upgrading the deal with New Zealand, all of those issues, those are all things that we really need to pay attention to. And we need to pay attention politically as well, obviously, to our allies to ensure that trade and other relationships are really up to snuff so that the China's extension of its soft power does not create more economic distortions or more strategic problems for our economic futures. Overall, though, I think it's fair to say, and I think you heard it hinted in the last panel, particularly from Wendy's remarks, that the international work is slow going. And I think in the short term, we're likely to see allies cooperating to really take concrete steps to stop China, only where they see a real and imminent China threat. So I think that means we're going to see potential unity around technology and innovation threats, cutting edge industry. So perhaps national security-based trade cooperation with allies in those spaces where there are credible threats. But otherwise, I think we have to be aware that our allies have no desire to be bossed around by the United States. And in some cases, they see gains, at least in the short term, in cooperating on trade, domestic industry, or sector that they think is going to be able to gain ground. That is a risk in their thinking. That is a risk in our relationships. And we need to balance reality as well as education on where problems really lie in that domain. But it also means that the US is going to need to use unilateral efforts as well as these allies. Biden can't afford politically to look or be soft on China. And if China is mistreating US companies, harming the US economy and US workers, or the US innovative future or US national security, Biden obviously will need to act. So what tools are available? What leverage do we have? When we're acting on defense, of course, we have our export controls, our CFIUS, our sanctions, our trade remedies actions, and actions that tie up individual bad actors. When we're on offense, obviously at home, we can control our ability, our actions, because we can build back better to compete better. So we need to do that. But what about actions against distortions in the China market? Well, what's our leverage look like now? The bilateral China trade deal, phase 1, already signed, already committed to by Xi Jinping. That is a point of leverage. And obviously the evaluation needs to continue, but keeping that in place and making it clear that China needs to meet deal conditions as opposed to letting them off the hook seems politically valuable and an important signal of strength to China. And it's really is a source of leverage because there are commitments that China has made through February of 2022 that we should look at and not just throw out or jettison without really thinking that through. There are pending Chinese actions regarding implementation of its intellectual property commitments. There have been some major Chinese purchases, even though it's uneven, and there have been COVID issues and economic issues that have made it very hard to meet those purchase commitments. But in any event, I think it's worth a really hard look. And we need to remember that this deal also includes the structure for a phase 2 agreement. So it's worth evaluating carefully what could be gained, because if it could be significant, then that's another tool that could be immediately at hand to take action. And maybe, the United States reduces some tariffs in return, and that allows us leverage and a possible win-win given the controversy over what damage the tariffs are doing to our economic growth. So overall, it's an advantage of an existing channel where there is genuine cooperation now. There is an enforcement mechanism built in, and perhaps it's a basis for some pragmatic trust building if China doesn't try to manipulate the situation. On the Chinese side, I would say it would be very unwise to come to the United States and try to offer up dialogue or as an alternative to anything else, or to offer up as reform something that China's already doing. The value comes in China continuing significant reforms with sincerity. Looking at another point of leverage, we have our aluminum and steel tariffs, and they obviously were put in place to curb the distortions from China's overproduction. I think that's an area where maybe they need to be looked at to rework the arrangements with some of our allies so that you're creating that wall against Chinese excess capacity without as many bad unintended consequences for our allies. But I think that's tricky because I don't think it's going to be easy to pull those tariffs down. And how will China react? I'll just finish up with a brief thought on that. China's already been signaling subtly that it wants to it look strong, but it also would value a more stable and predictable economic and trade environment. I think it also needs to continue to take steps to reform its economy so that it can keep growing and you can continue ensured Communist Party control. That's all self-interest, but that's true for any country, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be taking advantage of it to improve the situation as much as we can for ourselves. So China, for example, is continuing to work hard on meeting a lot of the Phase 1 deal elements that are realistic. And historically, China's been willing to silo different issues. So it's more than conceivable that it could continue to move forward and reform some of the economic distortions that are hurting China's future as well as that of the United States. But I'll close by saying I think China is unlikely to offer any bold new ideas up front. It traditionally, in my experience, has avoided making first moves. It seems as if they're afraid that they might give too much. Also today, we have to take into account the fact that China is feeling relatively confident. For example, its handling of the COVID lockdowns and the economic value that has had for its economy, I think is leaving it feeling quite superior to the United States. And that may reduce their anxiety about clashing with the US. To the extent that the last 4 years hasn't done that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right, we'll turn next to Sayori.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. This is such a great honor to be on this panel with two great women, and the previous panel was very exciting to hear. I learned a lot from it. So I see my role to be talking about Japan. This is I kind of make the case that there is a very important role that Japan can play and will play for the Biden administration as it comes back on the table in the context of trade and investment relations with the Asia-Pacific, with the Asian region. So first, I would like to talk a little bit about the achievement. I think quite a few of these issues are already put on the table, so I'll be very brief. But so Japan has done quite a bit in the last 4 years, to be precise, after the withdrawal of the US from TPP in 2017. Obviously, CPTPP has been agreed already in effect by the end of 2018. Japan also had concluded its EPA, the Economic Partnership Agreement with EU, which is already in effect from February of 2019. And UK's, the one with UK that Japan concluded last year, is kicking in, well, has already just kicking in this year, January. So all that coverage quite extensive. Along with it, obviously, the RCEP has been agreed upon in November, and really happy to hear from Wendy that there is a pretty kind of solid bet that it's going to come into effect in about a year from now. Obviously that doesn't have India in it, but definitely this covers 1/3 of the global GDP, which is really a big deal. So from the kind of very hesitant free trade agreement players, the kind of the past, Japan has really come a long way, which now the whole mega FTAs covers over 80% of Japan's trade. So just want to put this on the table to say that Japan is a significant player in this. And this year in 2021, Japan is the chair of the TPP committee, and UK just requested its entering its negotiation along with other countries possibly entering like South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, and so on and so forth. So altogether, it's a very important kind of Japan became a very important key in high-level trade and liberalization agreement, especially when the WTO is not functioning well or not functioning at all in kind of various aspects. So that I would like to kind of put that on the table and say Japan has achieved quite significantly. The second point I would like to make overall is the importance of these agreements and the kind of achievement that Asia Pacific has made in relation to the overall the economies of Indo-Pacific. First of all, RCEP, even though yes, true that their rules are not as high standard as CPTPP and various others kind of complain about that, but it is really important in the sense that it covers the supply chain of East Asia kind of overall. This cumulative rule of origin is quite important in providing the great foundation and great environment for the firms operating in this region, which has a very strong kind of intra-firm kind of a trade between each other. And this is really a key feature, especially in the context of the kind of COVID crisis, where some countries are now kind of looking inward, and this would really secure opening of these economies. And also in terms of even the rules, yes, true that CPTPP is providing significant rules. RCEP is not as much, but also RCEP has every 5-year revision clause, so that this might improve. But one thing, both CPTPP and RCEP, I would like to emphasize that has not been put on the table is that it's not only the rule-making, rule-based agreement, but this kind of agreement are tying hands or providing incentives for economies which are either the members or not the members, like China in relation to CPTPP, to conduct more domestic economic reform. One of the reasons why I would argue that China kind of flagged that they're interested in joining CPTPP, and which, by the way, China has done that back in 2013 about TPP2. That's a way for the domestic politics to kick in, where reformers will have much more leverage in implementing and pushing forward domestic reform in line with these high standard agreements. So overall, even if China is not in it, or even if some these standards are not as high, but it actually creates a lot of domestic political incentive for many countries to engage in further reform. So that's very important. Finally, in terms of the importance, there's a kind of a counter movement, or kind of another trend going on in Indo-Pacific, where the hedging of the kind of supply chain dominance on the part of China. So there are some other discussion, as you probably know, India, Australia, Japan concluded in the supply chain resilience, and also many of the countries are trying to hedge the supply chain dominance of China to have reshoring and kind of diversification of their investment in other regions. Obviously, Japanese government is obviously part of it, providing subsidies of $2 billion to reshore Japanese firms back to Japan, as well as a diversification of the supply chains in ASEAN and South Asian economies. Overall, though, it is really important to have high standard rules across this region, and CPTPP as well as RCEP has provided that for sure. So what does it mean looking ahead, and how Japan can play a role with the U.S. Coming back to the table, re-engaging with Asia? So I would like to point out three major points. No, definitely for one, the first, that Japan has a lot of interest in common with the United States. Many of the things that Japan is promoting now kind of came with Japan working along with the United States, like TPP, rule setting, a high standard of kind of investment protection, environment, multilateralism. All that is seems to be really in line with what the U.S. wants anyway. So definitely this common interest is a crucial point that I would like to make, that Japan would be welcoming the U.S. Engagement and re-engagement in this process. The second point, Claire's already talking about Biden relying on the allies. Obviously, Japan is a major ally in this region. And also, Wendy was talking about the kind of U.S. need of the trust in the region, kind of Asian confidence rising, and so on and so forth. And here I would like to emphasize that Japan has always been so-called underappreciated power. This was the kind of phrase that Mireya Solis from Brookings kind of published just a while ago on Foreign Affairs. But I really would like to encourage the U.S. Biden administration to look at Japan as an important player and acknowledge its kind of critical role in Biden administration coming back to Asia. Japan's, kind of so far has been really taking a role as the kind of leader of the Middle Power Coalition. Japan has also really bridged the very important link with EU, especially in the kind of digital trade and all that area. Also, even with China, Japan can be a part of this selective competition that U.S. is likely to be engaging in, and these are really, really important, kind of role that Japan can play. Even though some are kind of concerned by the fact that Abe administration in Japan, which basically led all these processes since the mid 2010s, has stepped down, but the foreign policy team and kind of a trade team all together are basically the same members, and Japan will stay the course in this area. So again, important to think that way. And thirdly, though, I would like to caution a little bit about this kind of there are parallel movement going on in opening and kind of a securitization of trade at this point. Obviously rule setting and kind of a ways to open up for investment, all that is kind of happening on one side, while there's a kind of a securitization of export control and investment control, so on, is happening at the same time. In some ways, Biden administration and Suga administration in Japan has to kind of strike the sweet point of these two kind of somewhat conflicting movement. And this is a really important time for them to collaborate closely so that they can set the stage for the future engagement. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. Finally, bring us home, please, Ellen.
I'm going to begin by laying out some basic facts about Southeast Asia and how important it is, and increasingly so, for the United States and the region. When I talk about Southeast Asia from a trade and economic perspective, I'm really talking about ASEAN, the 10 members of ASEAN. The combined population of ASEAN is about 650 million people. It has a combined GDP of almost $3 trillion, which puts it on a par with India, more or less, and it's about 3/5 the size of Japan's GDP. So it's become quite significant. It's the fourth largest export market for United States goods exports. and it's expected to grow at 5+% despite COVID, because it has several features that make it particularly dynamic. It is a young region. There are 380 million people in ASEAN who are under the age of 35. That's more than the entire population of the US. Moreover, as several speakers have said, there's been market opening going along gradually ever since the last 2 decades anyway, through the ASEAN Economic Community, beginning very modestly, and then, of course, through RCEP. There are 4 members of ASEAN who are also members of CPTPP. So all of these things make it a successful region, and in addition, it has managed to secure niche places in China-centered supply chains, as well as for companies that are lowering their presence in China or looking for low-wage labor. So I expect that the Biden administration will pay more attention to Southeast Asia than administrations have in the past, even the Obama administration. And of course, you add to that the geopolitical significance of ASEAN sitting astride the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, controlling the crucial Strait of Malacca, being the focus of Chinese efforts, and many of them bordering on the South China Sea, where China has tried to claim jurisdiction. So there's going to be an interest in the security community here as well. Let's not forget that Kurt Campbell, the new coordinator, has a considerable defense background. So with that factual background, let me say something about the Biden administration's trade policy vis-a-vis Southeast Asia, as I would see it. I think there's an important background comment that I'd like to make before I get into the specifics. Biden has talked a lot about multilateralism, which has been very welcomed in Asia, Southeast Asia. But he has embedded that theme of multilateralism along with democracy and human rights in a wider, broader narrative of restoring US leadership. He said several times, America is back, America is back. But when it comes to Southeast Asia, what does it mean to go back? Back to what? And here I have my own list of changes in Asia, comparable to some of the other speakers, in particular with effect on Southeast Asia. Besides RCEP and CPTPP that we've talked about, more broadly, America has steadily lost influence, and its image and credibility have suffered. This has been going on for quite a while, but of course intensified under Trump. As my colleague Satu Lemay says, of the Eastwood Center, yes, but, and the but is they vote with their feet, their family, and their finance, meaning they like to come to the United States, they like to send their children to US universities, and they like to park their extra money in the United States. So all is not lost. Ordinary Americans tend to be somewhat popular, especially in Vietnam and the Philippines. So there is an opportunity there, and I think that this is a good time to take advantage of it. The second change, besides the decline of American influence, I would name is something I think Wendy said, which is Southeast Asians have acquired agency during the Trump era, and they're not about to give it back just because the Americans want to restore leadership. So we have to be a little more modest, a little more humble than we would otherwise be. A third change, of course, is China. I think enough has been said about that, except for, in my mind, 2 very important themes. One is the establishment, co-founded by China, of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and the other is the wide range of BRI, Belt and Road Initiative projects going on throughout Southeast Asia. This is likely to have a positive effect on trade as more projects get going. And there's a question, though, as to whether there will be open procurement. In the AIIB, the president, Jim Lee Chun, has promised that the bank will be clean, lean, and green, clean being free from corruption, lean being more efficient, and green being environmentally sensitive. He's also pledged open procurement, something the founders like Australia and others care very much about. It's too soon to see whether that can happen, but I think Japan can be very helpful in this area particularly. And we've noticed already that some Southeast Asians have canceled or cut way back BRI projects. So there's something to watch if you're looking at trade policy. And the fourth change is, of course, Japan. Saori and Wendy talked about this. In an annual poll, when asked, Southeast Asians are asked which external power you trust most to do the right thing, the clear hands down winner is always Japan. Japan's rearmament, as some people call it, does not seem to threaten Southeast Asia. Indeed, they welcome it. And I think that role that Japan has played in CPTPP is echoed in other initiatives as well. The most striking one, I think, is the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, PQI, emphasis on quality, which implicitly sets up a slight competition with China because Chinese projects are not always known for their quality. Japan has also pledged to hire more local workers, which is another issue in Southeast Asia vis-a-vis China. And then at home, Japan has established an Office of Economic Statecraft as part of the National Security Council that Abe established and is lodged in the Prime Minister's office. So economic statecraft is seen in the wider context of Japan's strategic interests. So on the whole, Japan tends to be understated and doesn't pay attention to itself, but I see a really big change in Japanese leadership, and I think it's going to last. I hope it lasts despite the somewhat colorless prime ministership so far of Mr. Suga. So with those changes, then we're going to need a different leadership style, more modest, more listening, less finger pointing, a candid admission of domestic problems. And knowing the people who will be handling Southeast Asia, I think that's eminently doable. We also have to watch out for the US-China rhetoric. Southeast Asians would greatly prefer a toned down criticism of China, preferably not even a public one, because they don't want US-China tensions imported into their own institutions that they've been building so carefully in the last 2 decades in particular. More specifically then, what is ahead, in my crystal ball anyway, I don't think the effect of RCEP will be very significant on the United States or non-ASEAN countries. We can talk about that if you want. I don't see any huge changes in trade policy. We've talked about that too. The tough on China policy is partisan at this point. I don't think there'll be a rush to take down Trump tariffs, as we've seen with steel and UAE. I don't see any trade legislation going to Congress anyway for the next 6 to 12 months. Not even the renewal of Trade Promotion Authority. USTR has worked under the absence of TPA for at times and can probably do so again until the political climate is right. There is, I think, more than a hint of Buy America language in Biden administration pronouncements about the foreign policy for workers. That has to be watched carefully. It does seem time to rectify the imbalances from which workers have suffered, wage stagnation and the like. But I hope that trade policy doesn't become sort of the whipping boy on that. It's been long true that trade politics is marked by the conviction that because of imports that people lose jobs, not because of technology. And more to the point, they don't count imports as American jobs. When you think about, say, a major port, you're talking stevedores, you're talking insurance companies, you're talking retail, you're talking all kinds of business associated with infrastructure projects. And I think that I hope that the Biden administration sooner or later tries to explain trade policy and educate people in this broad way, not just thinking about imports as job losses. Standards have been mentioned. I think that's incredibly important. I do see work going forward on that. I think there's sectoral agreements we've also discussed. I think those are would ideally be global, but as Wendy says, we have to deal with what we've got. So I don't have anything to contribute to what's already been said there. I think OECD and APEC will both be helpful in the technical work for bringing Southeast Asians and others up to snuff on some of these things. With respect to more specifically to Southeast Asia, I think the Trump era fixation, President Trump's personal fixation on bilateral trade deficits will be dropped. Indonesia and Vietnam were previously targeted by this, and they will probably feel relieved. There will be, I don't think, any big changes in GSP. The wealthier Southeast Asians have already graduated. The question there is what to do about Myanmar, which went back, ended sanctions. We ended sanctions on Myanmar in 2016, and people will be looking around for something to do in response to the military coup. I hope it's not withdrawal of GSP, because that hurts poor people in Myanmar, but that's a whole ball of wax in itself. WTO, we mentioned, I can see as quiet support for reforming and restarting the appellate process, which is so central. That can be done in a very low visibility way. Given that the Biden presidency is emphasizing human rights and democracy, I do see that sanctions may be trotted out again, but the U.S., has been said, has very little leverage in this area, even if we use smart sanctions and target the top leadership. You know, they're not holding tons of money in the United States, as far as we know. So I think the most interesting development that I've seen so far, and I may be reading too much out of this, is that there are signs that the new administration plans to take a whole of government approach to Asia, including Southeast Asia, under Kurt Campbell. I have long been frustrated by the stovepipe phenomenon, that people can't get out of their stovepipes, and they're certainly not rewarded for cooperating with other U.S. government agencies. So trade policy may no longer be stovepiped as it was when I was in USTR. Henceforth, it could include tax and currency policies to help workers rather than tariffs. I think that would be an improvement. And the sign of that is the appointment of Brad Setzer as counselor at USTR. This was announced yesterday. As a tax and finance background, which is very interesting. I'd also personally like to see trade adjustment assistance revisited, so that we not spend huge resources on establishing the cause of a job loss problem, but could be earthquake, could be closure of a base, but instead have an adjustment policy more generally, making it easier for workers to move, to carry pensions with them, and so on. There have been proposals out there for a long time, and I'm hoping that maybe those will happen again. So I'm going to stop there. There are lots of interesting topics that have already come up that I don't have time to discuss, but let's move to the discussion and see what we can see.
Great. Thanks so much to all three of you. I'll go ahead and kick us off with a question to start with, and for our audience, if you have any questions for our three panelists here or want to revisit any themes, please just send them in the chat for the instructions earlier. All three of you, I believe, touched on some of the challenges that America faces in overcoming damage to or gaps in credibility and in trust from Japan, from partners in Southeast Asia, and in general in the region. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what the Biden administration can do to not just restore credibility, but also in terms of U.S. leadership. So Sarah really emphasized how Japan has taken on a greater leadership role, and we heard from the previous panel that the region has moved quite rapidly over the past several years in the trade field. So do you think there are steps that the Biden administration can take to restore U.S. leadership, or at this phase, is the focus more squarely on restoring credibility first. And sorry, we can go in any order you guys would like. Whoever has a first comment.
You froze up a little bit there at the end.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Let's see. Are you calling on me to start with? Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, go ahead, Ellen.
Well, I think
yeah.
I think we all should take a crack at this. I mean, I think the probably the best single step we can do is just what President Biden said. You know, clean up our act, get our economy moving forward again, handling the COVID epidemic better, and tackling seriously problems like racial injustice and the like. Our election system is, and it was on display in all of its weaknesses, and we just have to go beyond that. I think it's a series of small steps. I think showing up. We haven't talked about presidential travel, but the president's travel is a significant diplomatic asset, and it seen as a sign of interest and goodwill. It's very hard to get a president to go to the other side of the world, you know. So, but simply showing up, as Woody Allen would have said, simply showing up at these meetings in Southeast Asia anyway, which is timed with U.S. APEC Summit, ASEAN Summit, East Asia Summit, all these other things. If we could get the president to go on a sort of a goodwill listening tour, perhaps preceded by staff listening tour, I think that would be great. And the other issue has to do with the credibility of our defense commitments, and I won't get into that here. But I'd like to hear from others.
So my sense is I totally agree with Ellen that the U.S. being present, coming to listen, engaging, you know, not only kind of a head of the state level, but you know, other levels as actively as possible is a very important way. But also, I think in some ways, kind of not to kind of take the role as leading as kind of a deliberate thing or a kind of an announcement that U.S. would lead might be useful in the sense that U.S. would like to be at the table along with other members with the same respect to all the kind of members in this region, and go from there would be a welcome first step. Now, obviously, there are many places that U.S. would and probably has to lead, and that is important. But at the same time, when U.S. is kind of I am back and kind of impose another round of kind of a preachy, this is what Asia has to do type of kind of imposition, that might be kind of it may be a kind of considered as a tone deaf or not understanding where Asia is at this point. So obviously, yes, all the Asian members count on the U.S. to be present and be the leader, but maybe not being a kind of acting as though a new boss coming back to the kind of to the head of the table is probably a kind of a very good attitude to take.
I would actually drop the word leadership in favor of something like partnership. And as in your image, President Biden, I think before the election, wrote that he wanted America to be back at the head of the table. That's exactly what you're talking about, Sari. It shouldn't be at the head of the table. It should be along with.
It's a round table.
Yeah, it's a round table. Yes. Remember Vietnam negotiations.
Claire, I think you're still muted.
I was being polite. Such a mistake. No, I just a couple things to add in that. One is kind of to think about the United States really coming in, if it's been missing for a while, to come in with some significant value add in terms of the substance of its thinking. So when it is consulting with its allies, for it to come in with really good homework done on whatever the issues are. And when it's in the trade space, APEC is is an area where there's a lot of cooperative work that's done, but that's not the only one. So looking at the plurilaterals, looking at what's being done in the WTO, looking at any of the trade issues that are on side. But then what I'll say, and it may not be in the early days, but I would say that another thing that the United States has done in the past that it could then do again is sometimes it has to be the brave one vis-a-vis China, for example, to actually call out China because it has enough economic independence and size of economy to be able to kind of be the pointy end of the spear. And so it's conceivable over time after that consultation phase that the United States can again perform that role, which it's hard for a lot of other folks in Asia to say. So speaking truth to power, I would say.
Yeah, and kind of along that line, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts or other panelists on as some other U.S. partners in the region face really increasing levels of economic pressure and coercion from China in retaliation for other activities. China would prefer, for example, Australia facing significant economic blowback. And something that Japan has certainly faced in the past, Korea has its own experiences, and other countries around the world, including those in Europe, are kind of looking at these examples, Europe and Canada. Whether there are steps that the United States can take in coordination with these countries to help blunt the force of some of those economic impacts from China's tools of economic statecraft, kind of further afield.
I think that's a very important idea. One of the things that is the case, I think, about China is China views itself overall as being justified in its thought that it is kind of the center of the world, and that it has therefore kind of a reputation in a sense as being it can't be just an irresponsible, robber state. It can't be a banana republic. And so when it gets called out by the world community as doing something that is truly offsides and norms, and it is not related to one of its core interests, in which case he will just ignore you. But if it's in a large range of other areas, China will be affected by that. So I think that drawing together allies to object to and respond to things like what's happening to Australia right now, because China is angry at Australia, potentially because Australia said, let's have an independent investigation of what was going on with COVID. That's the sort of environment where the United States might be able to lead together with others. A leadership group, if you will.
Well, this is always the problem, getting others to go along with a high pressure reaction against what the Chinese have done. One of the things, by the way, I did appreciate about the Trump administration is that when the Australian spat broke out, President Trump ordered Australian wine to be served at all of the White House visits. But more seriously, look what happened in the Philippine case on the UNCLOS panel. Yeah, I mean, all the Europeans have tremendous trouble getting a united position on this. Before the case was decided, the EU issued very supportive statements about the rule of law. When the arbitration panel came out overwhelmingly in favor of the Philippines, you couldn't get a response because two of its members disagreed. And the same thing with ASEAN. This new Coast Guard law just passed the other day by the Chinese National People's Congress would allow the Coast Guard to fire on people encroaching on China's claimed territory. And again, only the Philippines, I guess Indonesia as well, only a couple of them spoke out publicly against it. So it's, the Chinese are pushing the limits, whether it's the South China Sea or the treatment of the economy. It's very hard to get other people to sign on to a criticism. And then when you criticize them, then Something where you can do talk. I feel sort of helpless these days with trying to put the envelope like that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree it's a very difficult challenge, but you know, economic interdependence kind of has that negative side to it. But I think the coalition, like you know, Indo-Pacific as the kind of open free kind of platform, all that would be one way to create coalition against some of these bullying behavior on the part of the big player. And yes, obviously, you know, one at a time cannot really stand against it. But if it's a coalition of all quite significant number of members in this broader region, I think it creates some kind of a signals some kind of really a resolve to push back.
Better than nothing, for sure. It's a signal, yeah.
Wonderful. So that actually takes us right up to time. So that I will go ahead and conclude discussion of the panel. And am I turning it back to Audrey? Or can I conclude us? All right. With that, okay, so thank you all for joining us. I want to thank all of our presenters and my colleagues at NBR, my colleagues from the Trade Center that helped organize this event, Doug Straub, Jonathan Merrick, and all of our support team at NBR, as well as Audrey Mossberger, who convenes all of our events. And thank you all for sticking with us for this great discussion. Audrey, any last words? Pop back in there.
No,
Thank you, Allison.
Thanks,
thanks also to Michael for chairing these panels.
Yeah, thanks to Michael as well.
Well, as Ali said, thank you to all of our presenters and to all of you who have attended over WebEx and live stream. And we look forward to seeing you at the next NBR event. Thank you so much.
Thank you.